If you look at somebody like Jim Bridger, Jim Bridger came west when he was 18 years old to be a fur trapper in 1823. And by the end of the fur trade era, he owned part of one of the big fur trading companies. But then the fur trading industry died virtually overnight. And we think today sometimes that the turmoil in the economy and that the rise and fall of industries is a modern phenomenon, but it's been going on forever.
This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle, marketing professor at the University of Montana. This podcast is my chance to speak with cool people doing awesome things in and around the great state of Montana. We are proudly underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot Communications. Hey folks, welcome back and thanks for tuning in. All of us here at A New Angle hope that your 2020 is off to a great start. Today's episode is a fitting follow-up to last week's conversation on the future of work with Scott Latham. We talk a lot here at the University of Montana about creating tomorrow-proof students. And today, we bring you a shining example of a tomorrow-proof person, Michael Punke. Michael's had an incredibly diverse set of career experiences: private law practice, a trade policy position in the Clinton administration, an ambassadorship to the WTO under President Obama, and now a corporate role with Amazon as Vice President of Global Public Policy for AWS. Oh, and how could I forget the thing for which Michael is perhaps most well known, writing The Revenant, among several other great books and screenplays. In this conversation, we talk about how all of those roles and experiences weave together to shape Michael's view of the future of work and his view of the future of higher education. AWS is partnering with the University of Montana and Missoula College on some interesting initiatives to cloudify our curriculum and make us more agile. It's disruptive stuff, and I encourage you to think about what you hear from Michael in the context of what we learned from Scott Latham last week. This is what disruption feels like, folks, so buckle up. Here we go with Michael Punke right now. Okay, so we're here today with Michael Punke. Michael, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks a lot. I'm excited to talk.
You're probably the most interesting man in Missoula, I would have to say.
Wow, that's now I'm nervous.
Well, yeah, that set the bar really high. But I just got to wonder, what do you do to support this habit of yours of writing books that end up as Oscar-winning films?
Well, the writing piece is a long story in and of itself, and kind of the integration of writing into other aspects and phases of my career is a long story too. But I guess the short version of it is that I've always really loved writing. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect of that is that I've always been interested in a lot of different things. So for me, I sort of fell into, or not, I didn't fall into it. I was interested in a policy career, and I've had a career on the one hand that started with law school and led me to work in Washington, D.C. and go overseas as ambassador capacity and now to work in a policy job. But I've always also loved Western American history. It's just been a passion of mine since I was literally a little boy.
Growing up in Wyoming, that's a rich
born and raised in Wyoming,
in.
and did a lot of typical, Wyoming Rocky Mountain type things growing up, and fell in love with Western history. And as I said, one of the jobs I had growing up that was most impactful to me in a lot of ways is I worked as a living history reenactor at Fort Laramie National Historic Site.
Okay.
So when I was between the ages of 17 and 20, my summer job was dressing up in an 1876 cavalry uniform, going out to Fort Laramie, marching around, doing flag retreats, firing cannons, baking bread in a wood-burning oven, and learning about Western history, and then also talking to tourists along the way. So, that's always been very much in my blood. And so I've never really, I guess, been willing to leave anything behind, either in terms of the interest on the policy side or the interest on the Western history side. And so along the way, I found ways to do both.
Sure. So you started, from Wyoming. You decided to go to college out east, UMass Amherst, and then eventually to GW, right?
I had a weird undergraduate career. I started off at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, as you said, and then the second semester of my freshman year, I actually went overseas and studied in France
That's pretty early for
It was.
College
it was
career,
more of a, typically people do a junior year
Right.
abroad. I sort of did a junior year abroad, but for half of my freshman and all of my sophomore year. And then at the end of being overseas, I wanted a broader international affairs program, and so I transferred to GW.
Okay.
And finished my undergraduate degree there. I had a chance to intern on Capitol Hill with Senator Alan Simpson. Being from Wyoming, Alan was my senator.
Uh-huh.
So I got some exposure to policy through that mechanism as well. Then I went to law school, and on from there.
And so out of law school, is that when you hooked up with Max Baucus and was a staffer in his office?
Fairly soon after law school. I worked in a law firm first for about a year and a half in Washington, D.C., and then I had the opportunity to go work for Max, and worked for Max for not quite 2 years before going into the Clinton administration.
Sure. Did you know during law school? I mean, you studied trade law. Did you know in law school that you wanted to go into public service, or were you?
Very much so.
You made a stint in private practice.
Yeah. I never wanted to be a traditional lawyer.
Okay.
And for me, it was a choice between law school and grad school, and I didn't want to take the time to go get like a doctorate.
Okay.
And a master's, a JD was 1 year more than a master's degree, so it seemed like kind of a good balance point.
Yeah.
But I always knew that I wanted to use the JD to work in a policy sphere, either in government or in private practice, but with a policy angle. And so I found first year of law school very hard because obviously you take a lot of mandatory courses that are designed to be most relevant to somebody who's going to be a real lawyer, and I was never going to be a real lawyer. So I knew that early on.
I don't even know what a real lawyer is.
I'm not sure anymore either.
Like Perry Mason?
Courtroom, writing contracts, things
Sure,
like that.
yeah.
That was not going to be me.
I was sort of reading between the lines of your logic there and thinking about my own experience. I mean, I certainly do a lot of things here, but a PhD is a fairly its utility is narrow. Let's put it that way. You learn more and more about less and less.
Yeah.
A law degree. I mean, you can do a lot of things with a law degree.
I have found I did not particularly enjoy law school, but I've always been very glad to have a JD because it kind of it is, especially depending on how you shape your legal education, can be a very flexible degree. And once you get through first year, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of the courses you take. I took a lot of international law type of courses, international policy, comparative courses that were helpful to me in one way or the other. And so I found the JD to be a pretty useful degree.
So you work for Max, and then you end up in the Clinton White House. And you're pretty big seats there, National Economic Council, National Security Council. How do you end up in these kind of high-profile positions at such a young age?
Well, I did it through being international trade person.
Okay.
So even in law school, as I mentioned, I studied international trade because to me that was one of the most interesting aspects of international law was international trade. And when I went to work for the law firm even, I was lucky enough to have a law firm job where a lot of the focus was on international trade issues. That was my focus when I first went to work for Senator Baucus. And, once you're in the mix of it in Washington, once you get that kind of first job where you're kind of on the front line of an issue, it makes it a lot easier to be in the mix for other jobs like that.
Sure, you're in the consideration set.
You're in a relatively small universe of people who are obsessed with that issue. And that was the case for me working for Max on trade. When the Clinton administration, when Clinton was elected into office, I knew people who were helping to fill out those staff level kind of positions on international trade. And because I'd been working on the exact same issues on Capitol Hill, I had good knowledge of what had been happening for the last 2 years, and that was something that they wanted. So I was in a good place at a good time.
And how does that work? I mean, I've interviewed a variety of people that have worked in D.C. in various capacities, and you're sort of looking at their career, and you see this alternation of White House stints by party affiliation. Yeah, very few people tend to sort of work across different presidencies, if that makes sense.
Well, I think there's two sets of government workers. There are career government people, and that actually is a big part of the government. especially in, it's a big portion of agencies like the State Department or the Commerce Department or the Department of Defense or the CIA. You have career people that are really, I think, the backbone of the government, because they have this long expertise that carries across administrations. And when in the best case scenario, when a new administration comes in, they are able to take advantage of this expertise that is sitting there. That said, obviously, when an administration changes, there's a new group of political appointees that come in.
Yep.
And I've always been I was never a career government person. I always came in effectively as a political person.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience was it's a good mix, because I think it's not a bad thing. Obviously, we want our political process to run the country, but it's nice to have that mix of new blood that comes with new administrations and existing expertise that can help. You can rely upon a career's worth of work.
Yeah. So what goes on for you during the George W. Bush administration? You go back into private law at that point?
I went back into private practice.
Okay.
And I actually had ended up in the Clinton administration working for a guy named Mickey Cantor, who was the U.S. Trade Representative and then the Secretary of Commerce in the Clinton administration. When the Clinton administration was over, he went into private practice to work at a private law firm, Mayer Brown. And I followed him into that firm and practiced law with him there ended up being a partner at Mayer Brown, was there for about, I guess not quite 5 years.
Okay.
I love Mickey. I love the people I work with. I hated being a lawyer in a law firm.
We can kind of see that coming from what you said before.
And so this was kind of my Shawshank Redemption moment, I think of it, where while I was toiling away at the law firm, I was chipping away at the wall.
Yep.
And for me, that meant writing the Revenant.
Okay.
And my hope was that if I could write a book, that it would give me the flexibility to live wherever I wanted to live. And where I wanted to live was back in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned, I grew up in Wyoming. I married a girl from Montana. My wife's from Livingston. She and I met working for Senator Baucus in Max's office. And we began plotting how we were going to move away from D.C. and whether we were going to go move to Wyoming or Montana. And also because I was working for Max, I had a chance to spend a lot more time in Montana.
Sure.
And not very far from where I grew up to begin with. And so not surprisingly, loved the state. And ultimately, we decided that we would, after I published The Revenant, we decided that we would take the opportunity to try something completely new, and I resigned my partnership at the law firm and moved to Missoula to write books.
That's so interesting to be writing a book like The Revenant, sort of a historical fiction account, but set in the zone that you're trying to write your ticket to get back to.
It was very much a escape from jail plot for me, because I was on a perfectly acceptable career track on paper. I mean, I was a partner in a law firm, and I made a good living, but I hated it, and I did not want to. There's a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who love working in government, and I really have always enjoyed the work that I've done in government. But I did not enjoy the work that I did in the private sector in Washington, D.C. And I knew that I was not going to just be one of those people who sat around waiting and hoping for, the right person to get elected president someday so you'd have another chance. And I wanted a little bit more control of my destiny than that. And, one way or the other, it sort of worked out. We moved out here in 2003, and I started writing books full time during that period. Also learned how to write screenplays to try and diversify my writing opportunities some.
Of course.
And it worked. Making a living as a writer is a dicey thing sometimes.
Certainly. And
there certainly were plenty of nights where I was worried about selling the next book or whatever it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
But it also allowed us to break away from a career path that I knew was not the one that I wanted to be on.
Yet you got the call to go back to Washington shortly thereafter.
Actually, not to go back to Washington.
Okay.
To go
to
overseas.
Go international. Correct.
And interestingly, I wasn't interested at all in going back to Washington during the Obama administration, and had done nothing whatsoever to kind of tee myself up to compete for a job back in Washington, D.C., but was sitting in my office in Missoula, Montana in, I don't know, the February after the Obama administration came into office, and got a call from my brother, who works in Washington, D.C., or did at the time. And he told me that the job of U.S. ambassador to the WTO in Geneva was going to be open. There had been a career person in that job who had announced that he was going to leave. And that job interested me a lot because it wasn't going to be in Washington. It was going to be an overseas position.
Geneva seems pretty attractive.
Geneva's...
And then in that field, you have such rich experience and training.
Right. And, I think while my wife and I wanted very much to have our home be in Montana and raise our kids here, we also wanted the opportunity, not just for us, but also for our kids, to experience other cultures as well. And so that's what we ended up doing. We kept our home in Missoula while we went overseas, but we had an opportunity for both me in terms of a really fun and interesting job, but also for my family to experience a different culture, which was a fun thing for everybody and an important thing for everybody.
And just for, the sake of the listener, what does the representative or the ambassador to the WTO do? What is the job?
So the job is, and one of the reasons I loved it so much is the ambassador part of being ambassador is interesting in terms of representing your country at, going to meetings and representing the position of the United States. There's kind of a diplomatic aspect, obviously, of being an ambassador by definition.
Formality.
But what I loved about the particular job that I had, U.S. ambassador to the WTO, is that I was the lead negotiator for a bunch of different trade negotiations. And I really love negotiating.
Okay.
And the work and strategy that goes into a negotiation to me is fascinating. And so on top of the kind of normal ambassadorial diplomatic stuff, which is interesting and fun, was something that to me was really fun, which was negotiating.
Can we talk about that
for
a little bit? Because right now, we're in the midst of this, I guess we're in a trade war, which we are in a describe trade war.
No, absolutely.
That whole framing is interesting. Trade war, you learn about it in history class, and it just seems like these negotiations as a construct are just thought of as adversarial in nature and zero sum and all of that. And what's been your approach to the process of negotiation?
Well, I think negotiations often are adversarial.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that they have to be zero sum.
Okay.
And that's maybe an important distinction. And
right.
I think that's particularly the case with trade negotiations. And, one thing about trade negotiations is it is a negotiation. You are at the end of the day trying to come to some agreement that both sides will accept willingly. And that doesn't mean you don't deploy all sorts of leverage to get to that end. But it's when you're negotiating with powerful adversaries, they have leverage too.
Mm-hmm.
And figuring out a way of navigating that really complex environment is the challenge of negotiating, and to me, what's most interesting about it. So, for example, we concluded a couple of trade agreements when I was in Geneva that I'm really proud of. The first one is called the Trade Facilitation Agreement.
Okay.
And it was the first time in the 20-year history of the World Trade Organization that the countries of the WTO came together and concluded a fully multilateral deal, meaning every single member of the organization signed on to that deal.
Okay.
And what it did, which trade facilitation sounds boring, and parts of it are, but what that agreement really did is it cut red tape and made it easier, especially for small companies, to be able to export their products around the world. And so it was an agreement that was widely praised by American business people, and none more so than small businesses who see that there's a global market out there, but oftentimes, because they're small, have trouble navigating the bureaucracy. And the trade facilitation agreement took away a lot of that bureaucracy in a way that really helped them. So that was, you can imagine, with 160 countries negotiating.
I can't even imagine.
It was an incredibly complex effort, but it ended up very successfully. The second agreement that I'm proud of that we did in that time that I was over there was something called the Information Technology Agreement, the ITA. And in the ITA, China, for the first time in 20 years, reduced its tariffs on a set of products that it very much did not want to reduce its tariffs on.
Okay.
Namely, information technology products, which, of course, are among the products that the U.S. is most competitive at exporting. Mm-hmm. And so that's a trade agreement that ended up covering about $1 trillion. It's trillion with a T worth of global trading opportunities. And we did that very much with China kicking and screaming. And we were able to organize a coalition of countries that together leveraged China into doing something it very much did not want to do.
Yeah, so they're giving something up. What are they gaining? Like, what does inclusion in that trade deal do for them?
So they also export technology goods, and some of the countries were opening up opportunities that they thought would be opportunities for their exporters as well. Ironically, the U.S. market in that area was already open, so we weren't giving up very much at all because the U.S. tends to have lower trade tariffs than just about everybody else, at least as a starting point. And so it was a situation where we gave up very little to gain an awful lot, including in the China market.
Gosh, I'm thinking about these tariffs as revenue streams. Like, what are they significant revenue streams for nations, or are they more just defensive kind of or competitive measures?
They are both, depending on the country.
Right.
And the U.S. over time has moved away from tariffs as a major revenue stream, but some countries still rely on them as revenue streams. Especially a lot of developing countries. A country like India, for example, has extremely high tariffs, and still look at that as a source of revenue they want to acquire.
Yeah.
I hate that we call them tariffs because it makes people think they're somehow different. They're taxes.
Right.
They're trade taxes.
Fancy word for tax.
Fancy words for tax, and the U.S. over the years has reduced its trade taxes largely because we've decided that we don't want to have high taxes, and largely because we think that having high taxes is bad. And so we tend to lose that sometimes in the tariff discussion. And when somebody talks about raising tariffs in the United States, substitute the word tax, and that becomes suddenly not so popular anymore.
You can see why the word gets used in some contexts.
You can,
I suppose.
But it's very misleading because tariffs are paid by American consumers, and when we raise tariffs, we're not raising tariffs on China because China's not paying them. We're raising taxes on the Americans who buy stuff.
A New Angle is underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot Communications, two cool companies doing awesome things all over Montana.
Hi, this is Anya Jabor, Regents Professor of History at the University of Montana, and you are listening to A New Angle.
And then thinking of tariffs and taxes and these trade conflicts, I can't help but think of, we had Jim Sciutto in a while back, and he was talking about how China had making decisions to put tariffs on soybeans in particular states. Like, that's a new form of election interference, if you will.
Well, China has
manipulation of some kind.
And the reason China put those tariffs in place was retaliation for tariffs that the United States put in place. So it not only had the tariffs that we put in place not only have the negative impact on American consumers who are buying stuff, who then have to pay higher prices, but they're also having the negative impact of spawning retaliatory tariffs, like the ones that have been placed on American agriculture by China, which has, in many commodities, made American commodities unable to sell any longer in China. The problem with that, in particular, is that commodities are sold by lots of different countries.
Right.
And so China doesn't have to buy American soybeans and American wheat and American pork and American beef. They can buy all of those things from our competitors. And while the trade war has been going on, that's exactly what they've been doing. They've been buying Canadian wheat. They've been buying Brazilian soybeans. They've been buying beef and pork from our competitors in Canada and from the European Union. And so you end up shooting yourself in the foot, and not just once but twice.
Right.
Once on the import side and once on the export side.
That was a point you made yesterday, I believe, interacting with some of the students over at the Bacchus Center, is that these bilateral types of conflicts, I guess, are much more destructive than going with a multilateral approach, right?
Well, nobody understands more than me how frustrating multilateralism is, because that was my job for 6 years, was trying to get these multilateral agreements.
All those countries,
and it will make you nutty. And quote unquote allies oftentimes are you wonder how they ended up being called our allies, because it doesn't feel like that. But at the end of the day, the benefit of those types of efforts is you spread out the pain of the negotiation, and you increase the pain of resistance by your counterparts. And so right now, in the U.S.-China context, for example, the pain of trying to get China to change its practices, and by the way, we should be trying to get China to change its practices, because they do a lot of things that we want to change and need to change. But it's American farmers who are absorbing the pain of that right now,
right? While
the rest of the world is laughing. There was a great article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago that said, the U.S.-China trade war has a winner, and it's ... Australia, because the Australians are exporting commodities like crazy to China.
They're filling
right
those
now.
gaps. Yeah,
they're filling the gaps, and the upside of all the frustration of trying to negotiate in conjunction with allies is that you make it much harder for the Chinese to divide and conquer, because you have the Australians and the Canadians and even the Brazilians as allies in a negotiation, and you spread out the risk, and so it is maddeningly complex and frustrating in the midst of it, but it can result in an outcome that I think oftentimes is much better.
Right. So your service with the WTO basically finishes with the end of the Obama administration. It's a political appointment you were explaining before. And you go to work for Amazon.
Right.
Amazon Web Services. First of all, that's a term we hear all over the place, AWS. And it's kind of a big part of the engine that's driven Amazon's success in the last several years.
It is.
What is AWS? Like what is it?
Sure. It's and I will confess that before taking this job, there was a lot that I didn't know about Amazon Web Services and the cloud in particular. But basically, the part of Amazon that people typically think of is the website where they go to buy stuff.
Yeah, you go buy stuff.
And it's interesting, the story of where Amazon Web Services came from. When Jeff Bezos was trying to invent an online bookstore in the early 90s, he realized that he needed the ability to store and process massive amounts of data, and he needed to be able to do that in an environment that was highly secure.
Right.
Because at that time in particular, people were not accustomed to shopping on the internet, and everybody was told that if you ever put your credit card on the internet, that your financial life would be ruined forever.
Oh yeah.
And so Bezos had to come up with a machine that stored and processed massive amounts of data and did it in a highly secure environment.
Right.
And the machine that a bunch of smart people at Amazon essentially invented was the cloud internet services. And having invented that machine for Amazon to use, some smart people inside of the company figured out that there might be lots of other companies
platform
that would like to use that type of those types of services, a place where they could store, process data in a highly secure environment. And that really was the birth of the cloud. And what the cloud really means at the end of the day is, instead of buying your own computer server and sticking it down the hall, you instead, through the internet, rent storage and processing space from a cloud company like Amazon Web Services.
You do that much better than I try to explain this to my mother pretty frequently, right? What is the
I've tried
cloud?
to explain it to my mother frequently too, which is why I hope I'm honing my story here.
It's getting pretty tight. It's better than mine. In fact, I might replay this portion of the podcast.
But I'll explain why that's so significant, because it's on the one hand, it seems like a very obvious thing, but the reason that the cloud has become as important as it has become is, before the cloud, anybody who used a computer, whether it was a person or a company, a big company, a small company, a university, a hospital, whatever, had to try and figure out how much storage and processing capacity to buy.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that's a really hard thing to do with very much precision. And if you make a mistake either direction, it's really bad. If you don't buy enough capacity, and say you're a company that sells concert tickets, then on the day that the Rolling Stones come to town, when everybody tries to go on the internet to buy Rolling Stones tickets,
it breaks you.
It breaks your system, and your system goes down. Or there was a great example, a couple of a horrible example in some ways, because it was the Red Cross. But during one of the hurricanes, news broadcasters said, go donate to the Red Cross, and hundreds of thousands of people responded to that call. They all tried to go on the internet at the same time, and the Red Cross's systems went down, and they lost out on all those potential donations, some of which people didn't come back. So what cloud computing allows you to do is ratchet your use up and down literally by the millisecond.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the Rolling Stones come to town, or if there's a hurricane and your need for capacity spikes upward, the capacity is sitting there.
And it's sort of distributed across a broad network of users.
And you pay for what you use that day.
Right.
And the next day, if your use spikes back down, then you don't pay for that. And so it's kind of a rent instead of buy type of thing, but the flexibility that you have in renting that space is enormous. And it turns out that all sorts of different types of users, customers, really appreciate that flexibility. And that's really what's helped to create cloud as being such an important industry.
And so now you're back you're working from Missoula.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so probably traveling a bunch to Seattle and other places.
Yep.
But one of the things you're working on is helping places like the university use the cloud to kind of reconceptualize how we
train
people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have some thoughts on how did that partnership kind of come to be, and what's Amazon's view of it?
Well, one of the most exciting things that I'm working on at Amazon is workforce development.
Right.
Which is, what I just described, and the fact that all sorts of different types of customers and users of the internet are seeing the benefit of the cloud, is this really tangible phenomena and dynamic all over the planet. And yet, as much as the trend line is towards cloud as opposed to storing information the old way in a server down the hall, as much as that trend line is spiking, we're still in incredibly early days of it.
Right.
So I have heard different statistics. That's currently someplace like between 12 and 18% of the data on the planet is currently in the cloud.
That's it. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly small amount. And yet what we know is, for the reasons I just described, over time that's going to continue to grow dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see at AWS is a need over the coming decades for a whole bunch more people who are skilled in cloud technology. And I think that's what we've been working with the University of Montana to do, and with other universities around the world, is to find smart ways to train today's students to be workers who will have a skill, namely cloud services, that is going to, we just know is going to be a central skill in the decades to come.
And we're talking about a wide variety of workers.
Yeah,
from
absolutely.
people out there, connecting the fiber optic cables. We can talk about that, to people, designing systems, implementing systems for sellers, a whole range of jobs.
That's right. And I mean, look, anybody I think in the world right now who gets a college degree in computer science or something related to engineering and or math and technology is going to not have a very hard time finding a job, because I think this digital space in our global economy is going to continue to grow, as we talked about. But one of the things that's really interesting to me is we see the need for all sorts of skilled workers who have more than high school, but not necessarily a 4-year degree.
Okay.
And so I think our community colleges are a place where there's going to be a lot of really interesting opportunities over the next over the coming decade to get a year or two worth of specialized training in something like cloud, and be able to then go and apply that. And so we did something really interesting at Missoula College a week ago. We worked with Sumitomo and the University of Montana and Missoula College to do a 2-day seminar to train 30 students how to use a machine called a fusion splicer.
Okay.
And I like saying fusion splicer because it makes me feel smart.
Yeah, it sounds like something from Star Trek.
It is like something from Star Trek. And what it is, at the end of the day, is the way that the machine that is used to pull together fiber optic cable.
Okay.
And fiber optic cable is the copper wire of the 21st century. It's what ties together the digital world. And there's fiber optic cable being strung all over the planet in volume right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not enough people right now who know how to do it, because it turns out that splicing fiber optic cable together is harder than splicing together copper wire, which even I can do. And so that's just one example on the infrastructure end of building that's going to be going on for the foreseeable future, where there is a big deficit in the number of skilled people that we have to do that job. And it was really fun, I have to say, to see these 30 students after 2 days to get this certificate. And I think there's a lot of them that are going to have very interesting opportunities soon.
So when we think about that, I mean, you're laying out an example of a technical skill that you can get training in very quickly and immediately put it to work in an area that's needed. Yet to sort of be, I mean, we're kind of zeroing in on this tagline, tomorrow proof, here at the University of Montana, and trying to prepare students, graduates, et cetera, for jobs we can't even imagine.
Yep.
So say you prepare a student for a job like that. At some point, I mean, maybe it's an ongoing thing, but at some point you sort of figure, well, the cable will be laid and then another skill will be in demand. Or, how do you prepare students to pivot from an experience like that to another?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think the specific training, I view it as a door opener.
Okay.
And if you have that training, there's going to be doors open to you for jobs that we know are coming that weren't open to you before.
Okay.
I don't believe that that'll be the only time in the life of a 20-year-old today that they likely will have to find another door to open. And I do think that that people in the global economy today have to think in a very nimble manner about how, as they're going through their career, they're keeping their eye on the horizon and thinking about, what am I going to be doing in 5 years?
Right.
And if they can see 5 years ahead and still see that this is their same job they're in is going to be a job that's there, then great. And there will be some jobs like that, presumably, although I would imagine in the job of laying fiber optic cable, that as fast as that technology changes, that's something where people are going to have to continue to update their skills as they go along. But look, I love, one of the reasons, and this is where for me, like, Western history comes together with globalization, is one of the things that the West is famous for, the American West, is a place where people have always been reinventing themselves. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you look at Western heroes, if you look at somebody like Jim Bridger, Jim Bridger came west when he was 18 years old to be a fur trapper in 1823. And by the end of the fur trade era, he owned part of one of the big fur trading companies. But then the fur trading industry died virtually overnight. And we think today sometimes that the turmoil in the economy and that the rise and fall of industries is a modern phenomena, but it's been going on forever. I mean, look at the Pony Express, which is famous. You ask people how long the Pony Express lasted, and they're surprised when they find out it lasted 18 months.
Yeah, pretty short time.
And it died on the day that they strung the telegraph between East and West Coast because it was disrupted by that technology of the telegraph overnight. But what did Jim Bridger do when the fur trade era was over? He had figured out that there was going to be an immigrant trail going from east to west, and in fact, he helped scout the trail that became the Oregon Trail, and he built a fort on the Oregon Trail and made his living for a decade or more selling goods to the immigrants who were coming along on the Oregon Trail. Mm-hmm. He ends up later in his career being a scout for the U.S. Army. He evolves through this whole dynamic century of the 19th century in the American West and adapts. And that ability to adapt to change is something that I think is always going to be, it's always been important, and history shows that. It's always going to be important. And so I do think that there is a huge burden and also responsibility on workers today to think in a very proactive way about getting the skills that can help them get the next job, but also looking ahead to how they're going to adapt. And that's, it's not the 1950s anymore where people had the ability to go work for one company for their whole career and retire with a gold watch.
Sure.
That's just not the world that we live in anymore. And I think one of the responsibilities of both companies like Amazon, but also the government, is to think about how do we prepare our workers to have both the skills but also the nimbleness and the adaptability that they're going to need to be successful, not just in their next job, but in the one after that.
I mean, thinking about that, Michael, there's a lot in there that strikes me. One is just thinking about your career and how you've been able to pivot to so many different things. But also that perspective drawn from history, the example of Jim Bridger, it makes me think about, yes, the students need some sort of a skill or a hook to get in the door. I like that metaphor. But also we have this rich tradition of liberal arts education and the humanities here. How can that sort of classical training, if you will, be leveraged to create this agility that you're talking about, this ability to adapt and to see the whole board?
Well, I can only speak, or I guess I speak from my experience, which I can say how having a liberal arts education was important for me. For me, having a liberal arts education taught me how to write and speak. And I think the ability to communicate is at the core of many, many jobs, especially in the 21st century economy. And learning, being a good writer, being able to express your views clearly and crisply is a skill that is essential in a whole number of fields and will continue to be even more important in the world that we live in today. The other thing I think that having a liberal arts background teaches you is nimble problem solving.
Okay.
And there are success in some jobs depends on a very particular skill set. And we talked about the example of knowing how to use the fusion splicer machine to join fiber optic cable. There are some jobs where that specific skill is essential. There are other jobs, and I think there are moments between jobs where that ability to adapt and be nimble and problem solve on the fly and work with diverse groups of people is the essential skill. And I think that a liberal arts education teaches you that because it exposes you to a broad range of areas of education. And I think people with that kind of nimble skill set are also going to be successful in the 21st century economy.
And I guess we're coming up against our time limit here. I want to be respectful of that, but if we as if institutions in general, maybe the University of Montana specifically, like if we're going to be preparing people or helping them cultivate this agility, as you say, how do we become more agile as an institution? I mean, an institution like Amazon, pretty darn agile for a giant corporation. An institution like a university, not so much. And some of that is by design. But how do we sort of reconceptualize what we do to meet the needs of not only cloud computing, but sort of the future of the economy?
Yeah. Well, I love that you're asking the question to somebody who works in education, because I think too often institutions don't ask questions. And institutions, we talked about individuals reinventing themselves. I think institutions have to reinvent themselves as well. And one of the things I do really admire about Amazon is its ability to be nimble, even as a very big company.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Amazonians are taught to do all the time is question assumptions, and to learn and be curious. And there are incredibly robust debates that go on inside of Amazon all the time about controversial issues, and that's viewed as being a very important part of the process. There's a concept at Amazon that I like a lot, which is a one-way versus a two-way door. And the idea is that a lot of decisions are two-way doors, meaning you walk through the door, and if maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong, but if you're wrong, you can go back through the door.
Okay.
Very few decisions are one-way doors, and where if you make that decision, you can never change it. And I think institutions a lot of times tend to think of too many decisions as being one-way doors that are actually two-way doors.
And we put a lot of steps in front of those seemingly one-way doors. Yeah.
And if it's not a one-way door, it should give us a lot of flexibility to take a chance and try something. And if it doesn't work, then change it.
Yeah.
And I see an institution like a university, and I think the stereotype of an institution like a university is that it's quite rigid in its decision making. And I think that the universities that will be most successful going forward are the ones that can, like the workers that will be most successful, are the ones that can adapt and be nimble. And I think that concept of thinking through very carefully what are the one-way door decisions and what are the two-way door decisions, and not treating all decisions as being the same is one tool for a more nimble decision making.
Yeah, it makes me think that, if we're trying to get students to be tomorrow-proof, we need to think about how we're tomorrow-proof as an institution as well.
I agree completely.
So, Michael, this has been fascinating. I appreciate
For me too.
you coming
Thanks a lot.
and sharing your time and wisdom with us, and also for kind of bringing this unique relationship that you have with, well, you work there, but your relationship with Amazon to the University of Montana, and this collaboration with this tech skills program is fabulous. I'm really excited to see what happens.
Well, thanks. We're very excited, and we don't know exactly where it's going in a good way, because I think we're brainstorming together, but we feel very confident that there's going to be a lot of good that comes out of it. So thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.
Okay, hope you enjoyed that one as much as I did. Amazing guy. Pay very close attention to what AWS is up to. It's affecting your life, whether you feel it or not. All right, next week we have our second installment of the Bryce Ward series. We'll reflect on a lot of this stuff you've heard over the last couple of weeks. Next week, stay tuned. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. And we're coming to you from Studio 49, a gift from University of Montana alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. And remember that A New Angle is supported by CED, Consolidated Electrical Distributors. These guys pretty much sell anything electrical you would ever need, but they also hire a ton of our students. If you want to learn more about jobs at CED, visit cedcareers.com. Before we go, I want to thank some important peeps: executive producer Stefan Borsum and interns Aspen Runkle and Max Gibson. Huge thanks to VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks for the tunes. And finally, props to Jeff Meese, our master of all things sound. Finally, if you have any questions, suggestions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. Help us spread the word, and be sure to use the hashtag #anewangle when you do. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.